When a leading lady arrives on set with a shattered face, a normal employer calls the police. A Hollywood studio calls for thicker foundation. The 1930s media aggressively pushed the flawless fairy tale of Joan Crawford and Franchot Tone. But when we put this aristocratic marriage on the autopsy table, we uncover a terrifying crime scene sanitized by a billion-dollar machine. Behind closed doors, the glamorous leading man was delivering brutal physical beatings. But the ultimate villain wasn't just a violent husband. It was the MGM studio system. When their most profitable asset arrived on set severely battered, the executives didn't protect her. They became active accomplices. To protect the box office, the system coldly buried her black eyes under heavy layers of theatrical grease paint. They forcefully marched a physically traumatized woman directly back into the arms of her abuser and ordered them to act out a highly profitable, manufactured romance. Welcome to the Fame Autopsy. Today we investigate Joan Crawford and Franchot Tone, beaten before filming, and how Hollywood covered up the truth. Yet the tragedy of the corporate cover-up was never an isolated incident confined to the guarded gates of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The predatory machinery of the Golden Age demanded sacrifices across all rival studios, operating on a unified code of silence. While executives in one corner of California hid the bruising of Joan Crawford, the power brokers at Warner Brothers were sanitizing an equally devastating psychological war. To understand the systemic nature of this cruelty, we must turn the autopsy table toward another profound tragedy of the era. This is not a story of physical blows leaving visible marks on the skin. This is the anatomy of a spiritual execution. It is the story of a magnificent theatrical queen who sacrificed her autonomous crown to build a cinematic god, only to be discarded the moment she aged out of the industry's ruthless parameters. We are reopening the classified files on the chilling destruction of Mayo Methot, the unprecedented rise of Humphrey Bogart, and the toxic, studio-manufactured illusion of the battling Bogarts. Before the tragic headlines, the shattered glass, and the suffocating betrayals, their love story sparked with the brilliant, undeniable light of authentic passion. To comprehend the agonizing devastation of what this marriage eventually devolved into, we must first reset our historical perspective. The narrative sold by modern cinema historians paints Humphrey Bogart as the eternal titan and Mayo as the unstable footnote. We must travel back to a specific timeline, the 1920s and early 30s, where the power dynamics were entirely reversed. In this era, Mayo Methot was not a tragic figure. She was an undisputed queen of her domain. Born in 1894 in Portland, Oregon, she was the product of a refined, highly cultured environment. Her father, Captain Bladel Methot, commanded ships navigating the treacherous Pacific waters, instilling in his daughter a fierce, unyielding resilience. Her mother, Evelyn, was a sophisticated society woman who recognized her child's raw electric artistic energy early on. Mayo did not have to stand in a desperate line to beg the California studio system for scraps of validation. Long before Hollywood industrialized the concept of celebrity, Mayo had conquered the most prestigious, intellectually rigorous stage in the American entertainment apparatus, the Broadway theater. The East Coast theater industry respectfully crowned her the Portland Rose. She possessed a towering theatrical talent characterized by a husky, resonant voice and an electrifying stage presence that demanded submission from the toughest, most cynical critics in New York. She anchored hit productions like The Song and Dance Man and Half Gods. She shared the stage with legends, holding her own in an environment where true talent could not be faked with clever camera angles or flattering lighting. She was independently wealthy, fueled by the lucrative theater contracts of the Roaring Twenties. She was fiercely autonomous, dripping with the kind of legitimate artistic prestige that synthetic studio-manufactured movie stars on the West Coast could only dream of achieving. Mayo Methot was a woman standing proudly at the untouchable summit of her power, wearing a heavy crown she had forged through thousands of live performances and undeniable brilliance. Operating in a significantly lower, far more humiliating stratosphere, there was Humphrey Bogart. Today, the global public recognizes that specific name as the immortal icon of cynical, hard-boiled cinematic masculinity. He is the trench coat, the fedora, the cigarette smoke curling in the dark. But in the hierarchical ecosystem of the 1920s and 30s, Humphrey DeForest Bogart was essentially a struggling, directionless character actor, carrying the heavy, awkward burden of immense privilege. He was not born in the slums. He was born into the suffocating aristocratic wealth of Belmont, New York. His father, Dr. Belmont DeForest Bogart, was a renowned cardiopulmonary surgeon. His mother, Maud Humphrey, was a highly successful, formidable commercial illustrator. In fact, Bogart's very first experience with fame was deeply emasculating. His mother used his infantile face as the model for the famous Maud Humphrey baby ad campaigns for Mellon's baby food. He began his life as a cherubic, velvet-clad prop for corporate marketing. Bogart squandered his early privileges with a rebellious streak that lacked real direction. He was expelled from the elite Phillips Academy in Andover, an institution designed to funnel the sons of the wealthy directly into Ivy League universities. Stripped of his academic future, he drifted into the United States Navy during the closing days of the First World War. It was during this naval service that he acquired the signature scar above his lip, a physical imperfection that would later become a cornerstone of his tough guy persona, but at the time was just another mark of a chaotic youth. Following his military discharge, he found his way onto the New York stage, but he did not command it like Mayo Methot. Hollywood, during its transition from silent films to synchronized sound, did not know what to do with him. He was an aging, deeply insecure actor trying to claw his way out of the windowless basement of the studio system. Powerful industry executives mocked his potential. They looked at his slight lisp, his average height, and his initial penchant for playing wealthy, spoiled playboys, and they dismissed him as a lightweight. They relegated him to disposable supporting roles, humiliatingly referring to him as White Pants Willie, referencing his frequent casting as a tennis-playing country club boy holding a racket and asking, "Tennis, anyone?" He was trapped in B-movie purgatory. Prior to meeting Mayo, he had navigated 2 failed, deeply unfulfilling marriages. He carried a heavy insecurity about a career that seemed destined for quiet, uncelebrated failure. He was a man approaching his late 30s, staring down the barrel of permanent obscurity. When these 2 drastically different universes collided on the Warner Brothers soundstage in 1937. It defied every logical rule of the Hollywood machine. The film in production was Marked Woman, a gritty, dark crime drama starring the powerhouse Bette Davis. But lurking in the supporting cast, the established Broadway queen and the struggling B-movie gangster found themselves sharing the same creative orbit. The patriarchal narrative of the Golden Age dictated a very specific script for romance. The wealthy, powerful male star swoops in to rescue the unknown, struggling young actress. But the dynamic between Mayo and Bogart was a breathtaking reversal of the established order. Mayo Methot, the reigning theater royalty, looked across the crowded, chaotic set at the struggling supporting actor. She did not see the mocked white pants Willie. She saw a raw, simmering intensity, a dark, cynical edge that the corporate studio system was entirely blind to. She recognized a man harboring a profound, unexpressed anger, an anger she found deeply compelling. She did not care about his entry-level studio salary. She did not care that his name was buried at the bottom of the promotional posters, far below the leading stars. She recognized a fellow artist who carried a fierce, unapologetic fire in his soul. This interaction was not a calculated, studio-mandated public relations stunt designed to inflate box office numbers. It was a visceral, profound collision of two strong human spirits who recognized the shared, underlying loneliness in each other. Mayo loved him with a fiercely protective ferocity. She possessed the industry leverage he desperately lacked, and she weaponized it on his behalf. She utilized her towering prestige to shield him from dismissive executives. She introduced him to the right writers, pushed him toward grittier roles, and loudly validated the raw talent he was struggling to show the world. She became his most aggressive advocate, convinced that beneath his insecure exterior lay a cinematic giant waiting to be unleashed. When they officially married in August 1938, in Beverly Hills, they did not just exchange standard vows. They forged a defiant alliance against the sterile, manufactured reality of the Golden Age. Their love was loud. It was chaotic, fueled by late-night debates over scripts, intense discussions about the nature of acting, and a shared disdain for the superficiality of the Hollywood elite. They were the ultimate dream of what human romance could be when it transcends social status and cynical corporate calculation. Mayo stepped into this third marriage with a wide-open heart, convinced that their shared devotion was powerful enough to conquer the American entertainment industry. For a brief, shining period, they were the magnetic anomaly of the town. They hosted legendary parties, radiating a raw, unfiltered authenticity that calculating corporate executives simply could not manufacture in a boardroom. They were partners in the truest sense, reading lines together, analyzing character motivations, and planning their mutual ascent. But in the cold, transactional architecture of Hollywood, true, unmanaged partnership is never a free privilege. It is classified as a massive corporate liability. The system does not tolerate anomalies, and it operates on a deeply ingrained misogyny that refuses to forgive a woman who dares to be the foundational strength of her husband's success. When you operate inside a multi-million-dollar machine that treats human souls like commodities, your relationship never truly belongs to you. It belongs to the shareholders. The ruthless, invisible blade of the studio system was already beginning to sharpen in the shadows, patiently preparing to dissect and destroy the most beautiful thing Mayo Methot had ever built. The corporate ledgers were opening, and the unforgiving mathematics of age were about to be weaponized against the Portland Rose. When Mayo Methot married Humphrey Bogart, she genuinely believed they were constructing an equal partnership. She envisioned an artistic syndicate where they would conquer the industry side by side. But the brutal architecture of the Hollywood studio system operates on a terrifyingly gendered double standard. As the calendar pages turned into the early 1940s, the fundamental physics of their marriage experienced a catastrophic inversion. The very same industry that had once worshipped her as Broadway royalty began to systematically dismantle her existence. To understand this sickening process, we must look directly at the unforgiving realities of age and gender in the Golden Age. For a male actor like Humphrey Bogart, turning 40 was a cinematic rebirth. His rugged lines, his thinning hair, and his deepening voice were monetized by the studios. Warner Brothers executives marketed his aging process as character, gravitas, and ultimate masculine authority. But for a woman operating within the same system, crossing the threshold of 35 was a legally binding professional death sentence. The studio executives did not look at Mayo Methot and see a towering theatrical talent with decades of stage experience. They looked at a woman who had aged out of their specific toxic definition of female sexual utility. In their cold corporate ledgers, she was officially classified as expired merchandise. This was the precise era where the marginalized white pants Willie mutated into a global cinematic god. The transition did not happen in a vacuum. It was supported by the woman standing in his shadow. Mayo was instrumental in Bogart's evolution. She read scripts with him deep into the night. She encouraged him to embrace the dark, cynical edge that the studios had previously ignored. She recognized that the era of polished, aristocratic leading men was fading, making room for the gritty, flawed anti-hero. When Warner Brothers handed him the role of Roy Earl in the 1941 masterpiece High Sierra, and later the iconic Detective Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, Bogart finally possessed the material to match his simmering intensity. The studio machinery shoved him to the pinnacle of the A-list. His face was cemented firmly into the global consciousness. He was no longer a struggling actor begging for scraps. He was a multi-million-dollar corporate titan. The balance of power inside their Beverly Hills home shifted with seismic force. The man she had shielded was now standing on a summit she was no longer permitted to access. The immense depth of Mayo's dedication to her husband was tested not just in the luxury of California, but on the grueling, dangerous front lines of the Second World War. In 1943, at the height of the global conflict, the couple volunteered for the United Service Organizations, embarking on a massive, punishing USO tour to entertain Allied troops. They traveled through the blistering heat of North Africa and the war-torn landscapes of Italy. The conditions were brutal. They performed on makeshift wooden stages constructed on the beds of military trucks, surrounded by the deafening roar of artillery fire. They slept in damp tents, subsisted on military rations, and pushed their physical limits to offer a brief respite to thousands of homesick soldiers. Mayo sang her heart out. She delivered her Broadway routines with the same fierce energy she had utilized in New York theaters. She pushed through exhaustion, illness, and the terrifying reality of an active war zone. But when the newsreels were shipped back to the United States, the Warner Brothers publicity department executed a master class in selective editing. The propaganda machine focused its blinding spotlight squarely on Humphrey Bogart. The headlines praise the rugged, cinematic tough guy bringing a piece of Hollywood to the boys in uniform. Mayo's towering efforts, her physical sacrifices in the desert heat, were relegated to the background. She was framed merely as the dutiful companion holding his microphone. Her individual artistic contribution was erased from the historical record, buried under the sand of foreign battlefields to ensure the unblemished descendants of her husband's brand. The suffocation finalized when they returned to the United States. The prestigious scripts stopped arriving at their estate. The powerful directors who used to court her simply stopped returning her phone calls. The industry did not formally fire her. They simply erased her from their reality. She was trapped inside a massive, luxurious house they had ironically named Sluggy Hollow, watching with paralyzing clarity as her husband's career exploded into the stratosphere while her own existence evaporated into nothingness. The press, dictated by the studio PR machine, stopped referring to her by her respected name. She was no longer the brilliant Portland Rose. She was casually reduced to 4 suffocating words: Humphrey Bogart's aging wife. This is the ultimate cruelty of the patriarchal entertainment machine. It weaponized her own biological timeline against her. It isolated her, severed her from her creative lifeblood, and forced her to stand in the shadows, silently holding the coat of the man whose towering success she had helped engineer. She was expected to smile politely for the flashing cameras, to gracefully accept her obsolescence, and to ignore the devastating reality that the industry had consumed her talent and spat her out. But Mayo Methot was not a passive, submissive victim. She was a fiercely proud, highly intelligent woman who suddenly found herself drowning in the toxic, freezing waters of irrelevance. As she watched her husband become an untouchable global icon, surrounded by a machine that despised her, the terrifying pressure inside the marriage reached an explosive threshold. The beautiful, chaotic love that had once defied the world was mutating into something incredibly dark, intensely resentful, and inherently dangerous. The psychological architecture of a human being is not designed to endure the constant, suffocating pressure of public erasure. When the Hollywood studio system dismantled Mayo Methot's career and compressed her identity into the humiliating box of simply being Humphrey Bogart's wife, they did not just end her professional life, they triggered a catastrophic internal mutation. We must clinically examine the horrifying reality of her daily existence during this era. She was a woman who possessed a towering, explosive artistic energy, an energy previously utilized to captivate thousands of people on Broadway stages. Now that immense kinetic force was trapped inside a luxurious Beverly Hills mansion, famously dubbed Sluggy Hollow by the couple, with nowhere to go. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing claustrophobia. The expensive walls of her home slowly transformed into a gilded, heavily guarded cage. She was isolated, surrounded by the deafening silence of unreturned phone calls. While her husband left every morning to receive the global adoration she felt she had earned the right to share. Faced with this agonizing, inescapable reality, Mayo did not execute a graceful, polite retreat. She did not accept her designated role as the invisible, supportive shadow. She desperately sought a mechanism to numb the unbearable psychological pain of her obsolescence. She plunged into the dark, suffocating abyss of severe alcoholism. The elegant, sophisticated Portland Rose was consumed by the heavy, toxic fog of imported liquor. Alcohol, in this specific psychological context, did not act as a mere sedative. It acted as highly volatile, explosive fuel. The agonizing resentment she harbored toward the industry and increasingly toward her own husband mutated into a terrifying paranoid psychosis. She began to view Humphrey Bogart not as her beloved partner, but as the physical embodiment of the very system that had destroyed her. He possessed the towering success, the adoring public, and the cinematic immortality that she had been denied simply because she had crossed an invisible, biological age threshold. The glittering Hollywood mansion rapidly devolved into a dangerous, toxic battlefield. The beautiful, chaotic passion that initially defined their marriage inverted, transforming into a cycle of brutal, relentless destruction. The arguments escalated from shouting matches into terrifying displays of visceral aggression. Operating under the blinding, uncontrollable rage of her addiction and her psychological trauma, she weaponized her own home. She shattered expensive antiques, hurling crystal glasses and heavy furniture at the man she once swore to protect. In fits of paranoid desperation, she even set fire to their own property, trying to burn down the suffocating reality she was trapped inside. The climax of this domestic nightmare, the point where the marriage crossed the irreversible threshold of physical danger, occurred during one of her most severe alcohol-fueled breaks. The specific details are chilling. Blinded by a toxic cocktail of rage and despair, she did not simply throw an object. She initiated a targeted physical assault. She acquired a sharp weapon from within the home and delivered a severe physical laceration directly to her husband's back, an injury so severe it caused the most famous cinematic tough guy in the world to collapse in agony. We must pause and dissect the sheer tragedy of this specific moment. This was not the action of a cold-blooded villain. It was the desperate, terrifying scream of a woman drowning in the dark. She was a brilliant, fiercely independent artist, systematically crushed, marginalized, and erased by a ruthless, patriarchal, capitalist machine. She was bleeding out psychologically, stripped of her human dignity, and she lashed out at the only target available to her. The studio system had manufactured Humphrey Bogart into a global icon, but in the process, they had driven his wife to the terrifying edge of violent instability. She was a bird throwing herself against the bars of a golden cage, unaware she was only destroying herself. When a woman is drowning in her own home, when the heavily fortified oak doors of a Beverly Hills mansion can no longer contain the visceral sounds of shattering glass and desperate screams, a functioning society intervenes. A normal community sends medical professionals to secure basic physical protection. But this was not a normal society. This was the golden age of Hollywood, a guarded, ruthless ecosystem devoid of fundamental human empathy. The horrifying reality of Mayo Methot's psychological collapse did not remain a classified secret. The rumors inevitably leaked out, seeping directly into the greedy, waiting hands of the Hollywood press corps. Faced with undeniable evidence of severe domestic distress, chronic alcoholism, and a marriage that had devolved into a war zone, the media did not react with journalistic integrity or moral outrage. They reacted with sociopathic glee. The magazine editors and powerful gossip columnists realized they were sitting on a massive, highly lucrative gold mine. Instead of exposing the tragedy or offering a shred of human decency to a deeply sick woman, they executed a cold-blooded decision. They weaponized the turmoil. They sanitized the trauma, packaged it, and aggressively sold it to the American public as a highly entertaining romantic comedy. They officially baptized this terrifying nightmare with a catchy, deeply offensive nickname, printing it in towering, bold letters across thousands of front pages: The Battling Bogarts. We must pause and process the sickening cruelty of that specific moniker. They took the agonizing reality of a woman suffering a severe psychotic break, a woman actively trying to destroy herself and her husband in fits of blinding, alcohol-fueled rage, and they casually reduced it to a quirky, marketable sitcom trope. They transformed physical lacerations and the desperate cries of a broken mind into cheap punchlines. To the millions of people reading these magazines over their morning coffee, the flying heavy objects and the screaming matches were just amusing proof of a fiery, passionate Hollywood romance. The public laughed enthusiastically, entertained, while a human being was suffering in the dark. But the press could not maintain this terrifying, synthetic illusion on their own. The invisible villain in this tragedy was the massive corporate machinery of Warner Brothers. When the domestic turbulence escalated to the point where Humphrey Bogart was physically injured, the studio executives did not initiate a psychological intervention for his deeply traumatized wife. They looked at Humphrey Bogart, their multi-million-dollar untouchable cinematic god, and realized their most valuable corporate asset was in jeopardy. They immediately deployed their elite crisis management teams, the ruthless studio fixers whose professional existence was dedicated to altering reality. These fixers did not arrive at the mansion with doctors or counselors. They arrived with thick stacks of untraceable cash. Warner Brothers aggressively bribed the leading journalists, the local police departments, and the hospital staff. They executed a massive, coordinated cover-up operation to bury the actual police reports and hide the physical damage. Whenever an altercation occurred, the studio public relations department issued a sanitized, fabricated press release. They deliberately rewrote the narrative, officially classifying the bloody violence as mere exaggerated domestic tension or the spirited disagreements of two passionate artists. This is the darkest, most suffocating reality of the capitalist entertainment machine. Mayo Methot was trapped in a psychological hell, desperately screaming for a lifeline, and the entire system simply turned up the volume of the audience's laughter to drown her out. The studio executives enabled her destruction because a controversial, passionate marriage kept Humphrey Bogart's name dominating the front pages, driving up the box office revenue for his upcoming films. They monetized her severe mental illness. They placed a desperate, traumatized woman into a glittering gladiator arena, handed the American public their popcorn, and charged admission to watch her agonizingly tear herself apart. In Hollywood, your pain is never your own. If the corporate machine can find a way to spin it, your darkest, most personal tragedy is just another leveraged, highly profitable studio asset. The fatal laceration that severed the lifeblood of this tragic marriage did not originate from the oppressive Warner Brothers executives. It did not come from the vicious gossip columnists or the merciless ticking clock of the aging process. The most devastating cut was delivered in the agonizing silence of their own reality, directly by the very man to whom Mayo Methot had surrendered her towering legacy. By 1944, the psychological architecture of their union was in ruins. Mayo was a shattered shell of the magnificent Broadway queen she once was, consumed by severe alcoholism and the paranoid terror of her own irrelevance. But instead of reaching down into the dark abyss to pull his wife to safety, Humphrey Bogart, now standing at the untouchable summit of global fame, made a cold-blooded decision. He walked onto the Warner Brothers soundstage for a film titled To Have and Have Not, and he locked eyes with his new leading lady. Her name was Lauren Bacall, and she was 19 years old. We must pause and clinically dissect the sheer cruelty of that specific number, 19. In the ruthless transactional economy of the Golden Age, a 19-year-old girl is the most valued currency in existence. Lauren Bacall was not just a young actress. She was the breathing embodiment of the flawless, radiant spring that the Hollywood machine had stolen from Mayo. Bacall possessed unblemished skin, an unbroken spirit, and a naive adoration for her leading man. When Humphrey Bogart looked at his wife Mayo, he saw a dark mirror reflecting his own insecure past. Mayo knew him when he was a nobody. She knew the desperate, humiliated actor begging for supporting roles. She remembered the man mockingly called White Pants Willie. But when he looked at the 19-year-old Lauren Bacall, he saw a beautiful canvas that only recognized him as an immortal, cinematic god. In the classic tradition of toxic male supremacy, his fragile ego demanded the blind worship of a teenager over the scarred loyalty of the woman who had actually helped build his empire. Faced with the choice between honoring the sacred vows he made in the trenches and the selfish allure of a fresh trophy, Humphrey Bogart executed a ruthless psychological betrayal. He did not just initiate a quiet affair. He fell aggressively and spectacularly in love with the teenager right in front of the flashing cameras. He utilized the immense spotlight of his newfound power to parade his new acquisition, abandoning his ill wife in her darkest hour. Imagine the sheer horror of that exact pain. Imagine being trapped inside a cold Beverly Hills mansion, your body and mind ravaged by addiction and grief, staring at the front pages of the morning tabloids. You see the man you sacrificed your autonomous identity for, the man you fiercely protected when the world called him a failure, staring into the eyes of a girl young enough to be your own daughter. It is not just the tragic conclusion of a romance. It is the brutal trampling of your fundamental human dignity. The corporate studio machine immediately recognized the massive financial potential of this new, youthful romance. The public relations department pivoted, marketing Bogart and Bacall as the ultimate Hollywood destiny, while simultaneously painting Mayo as the hysterical, unhinged obstacle standing in the way of true love. The industry validated his betrayal, rewarding his infidelity with massive box office returns. Mayo realized with freezing clarity that she had been scammed by the patriarchal machine. She was the foundational scaffolding used to construct a towering monument, and the exact second the monument was completed, the scaffolding was dismantled and thrown into the garbage. To Humphrey Bogart, she was no longer a beloved equal or a human being in pain. She was an expired contract. He stepped over her shattered soul to place the crown she had helped forge directly onto the head of a teenager. The most excruciating laceration in this tragic autopsy did not happen behind the fortified doors of their Beverly Hills mansion. It was dragged out into the unforgiving light of the public stage. To understand the agonizing rock bottom of a human soul, we must first listen to the suffocating silence of a Hollywood estate at 3 o'clock in the morning. Imagine the sheer psychological claustrophobia, the expensive grandfather clocks ticking in the dark. Mayo Methot, a woman physically and mentally ravaged by chronic insecurity and severe sleep deprivation, wandering the empty marble halls of her own home. And then she hears it, the hushed, intimate whispers of her husband. The man she had fiercely protected when the industry mocked him was speaking softly on the telephone to a 19-year-old girl. The visceral terror of that moment snapped the final thread of her sanity. She did not confront him with the dignified grace of the Broadway queen she once was. She collapsed into a state of hysterical desperation. She ripped the telephone receiver away. She screamed into the dead of night, her voice echoing off the expensive walls, begging and threatening for a ghost of a romance that had already perished. It was the pathetic sound of a woman stripped of her dignity, reduced to an emotional beggar, weeping on the floor of her own bedroom. But the insurmountable tragedy of a psychological collapse is that a drowning woman will grasp at a razor blade if she believes it will pull her to safety. Driven by a toxic cocktail of denial and panic, Mayo made a catastrophic decision. She decided she was going to march directly onto the guarded Warner Brothers soundstage to reclaim her territory. She wanted to look the 19-year-old Lauren Bacall in the eyes and publicly remind the Hollywood machine exactly who held the legal title of Mrs. Humphrey Bogart. She was no longer the radiant Portland Rose. She was 40 years old, a number the patriarchal industry classified as a terminal disease. Her physical form was ravaged by years of domestic warfare and addiction. Her face was swollen, her hands trembling. She desperately painted on a thick layer of theatrical makeup, applying bright red lipstick as a heartbreaking armor designed to hide a shattered soul. She stepped onto the lit set of To Have and Have Not, the exact cinematic arena where her husband and his teenage co-star were falling in love in front of the world. In an agonizingly forced display of marital ownership, Mayo latched onto Humphrey Bogart's arm. She pasted on a frantic, brittle smile, projecting the image of the confident Hollywood wife. She turned to look directly at Lauren Bacall, trying to assert dominance over a girl who possessed the unblemished youth the studio system had stolen from her. And this is the exact microsecond where the ultimate stab in the back was delivered. Humphrey Bogart did not gently pull his wife aside. He did not offer a single shred of protective grace to the woman who had held his hand when he was a worthless supporting actor. Instead, he looked down at the swollen, trembling woman clinging to his arm, and his eyes filled with unmasked public disgust. He looked at her not as a partner, but as an embarrassing nuisance actively disrupting his lucrative fairy tale. But the most devastating laceration came directly from the 19-year-old girl. Lauren Bacall did not look at Mayo Methot with fear, jealousy, or anger. She looked at the former Broadway legend with sickening pity. To a fiercely proud woman like Mayo, hatred is acceptable. Hatred means you are still considered a viable threat. But pity? Pity is the ultimate eradication of your human worth. In that lit room, surrounded by whispering camera crews and judging executives, Mayo realized the inescapable truth. She was no longer a rival. She was just a tragic, broken joke. She had willingly walked into the gladiator arena to fight for her marriage, only to realize her husband had already handed the sword to the enemy, leaving her bleeding on the cold floor of her own shattered dignity. The Hollywood publicity machine is an amoral, efficient weapon. It does not possess a conscience, and it does not care about the truth. It only cares about the equations that drive box office revenue. For years, Warner Brothers had profited off the volatile reality of the Methot and Bogart marriage. They had sold the public the sanitized illusion of the battling Bogarts, framing her trauma as quirky, passionate devotion. But the moment Humphrey Bogart fell in love with a 19-year-old, the corporate mathematics changed. The studio executives faced a massive public relations crisis. In the conservative era of the 1940s, a married middle-aged male star leaving his wife for a teenager was a scandal that could destroy a career. If the public viewed Bogart as a cruel husband abandoning his loyal wife, the investment would evaporate. The corporate machinery needed to launder this affair. They desperately needed to reframe Bogart as a tragic hero seeking an escape. And to create a hero, the system requires a terrifying villain. The target was locked. The invisible gears of the Warner Brothers publicity department shifted into reverse, executing one of the most sickening coordinated character assassinations in the history of the American entertainment apparatus. Practically overnight, the fabricated narrative of the spirited wife was dismantled. The exact same studio fixers who had previously bribed journalists to hide the domestic turbulence were now paying those same journalists to broadcast it, but with a toxic twist. They weaponized Mayo Methot's severe alcoholism and her psychological collapse, utilizing her lowest moments as corporate ammunition against her. The gossip columns changed their vocabulary. They stripped away the prestigious title of the Portland Rose. They erased the historical fact that she was once a towering, independently wealthy Broadway queen who had financially supported Bogart when he was a nobody. Instead, the media rebranded her as a pathetic, unhinged, raging alcoholic. She was explicitly painted as a hysterical, violently jealous obstacle, a suffocating anchor dragging down the beloved cinematic god. We must pause and dissect the sheer cruelty of this systemic reversal. This was not just a bitter divorce, it was a corporate-sponsored public execution. The studio fed the press exaggerated stories of her erratic behavior, ensuring the nation viewed her with unmitigated disgust. They engineered a narrative where her understandable grief over her husband's public infidelity was framed as clinical insanity. Imagine the horror of being trapped inside that psychological meat grinder. Mayo was drowning in addiction, her heart shattered by the ultimate betrayal. And when she looked to the outside world for a shred of empathy, she found a coordinated firing squad. The American public, manipulated by studio propaganda, eagerly swallowed the new narrative. They cheered for the fresh romance of Bogart and Bacall, ignoring the fact that their new favorite fairy tale was built directly on top of the destroyed life of another woman. The corporation created the toxic environment that broke her. They enabled the turbulence that shattered her. And when she was no longer a useful accessory to their primary asset, they destroyed her reputation to clear the path for a more profitable romance. Mayo Methot was stripped of her identity, her dignity, and her voice. The system dictated that she must be the villain, forcing her to absorb the entire moral failing of the man who had betrayed her. It was a cold-blooded corporate masterclass in victim blaming, a chilling reminder that in Hollywood, the only thing that matters is who controls the printing press. The most unsurvivable wound that finally severed the lifeline of this marriage did not originate from the studio fixers. The lethal laceration was delivered in the cold silence of their own reality, faced with the choice between honoring his vows to a deeply sick woman and the selfish allure of a teenage bride. Humphrey Bogart executed a cold-blooded decision. He filed the divorce papers, but he actively weaponized the legal system to deliver one final blow. In the official court documents, the man whose towering cinematic empire she had helped build took no responsibility for the toxic war zone their home had become. Instead, he publicly dumped the catastrophic failure of their 7-year union squarely onto her bleeding shoulders. He explicitly accused her of damaging his pristine, lucrative public image. He took a woman whose mental health had been shattered by his blatant infidelities and the crushing weight of the studio system, and prosecuted her as the sole hysterical villain of his manufactured narrative. But the true masterpiece of his cruelty was not the legal divorce itself. It was the terrifying sociopathic speed of his emotional erasure. The ink on the final termination of their marriage was not even dry. Exactly 11 days. We must pause and let that specific number sink into our consciousness. 11 days after legally discarding the woman who had fiercely protected him when he was a mocked supporting actor, Humphrey Bogart stood under the California sun and hosted a lavish, spectacular wedding ceremony to bind himself to his 19-year-old co-star. He did not grant Mayo the basic human courtesy of a respectable mourning period. He flaunted his brand new acquisition to the entire globe before his ex-wife had even finished packing her belongings. While Mayo Methot was sitting in freezing isolation, stripped of her identity, her brilliant theatrical career, and her dignity, her ex-husband was eagerly posing for the flashing cameras. He was raising a crystal glass of expensive champagne, smiling alongside the Hollywood elite to celebrate his new fairy tale. Mayo realized that to Humphrey Bogart she was nothing more than a disposable piece of sacrificial scaffolding. She was utilized entirely to elevate him to the summit of the industry, and the exact second she was no longer deemed useful, she was kicked into the abyss to clear the path for a younger model. It was a sharp, relentless stab in the back, an emotional destruction delivered without a single shred of remorse and without a final word of goodbye. When the heavy iron gates of the Warner Brothers studio permanently slammed shut behind Mayo Methot, they sealed her inside a suffocating tomb of public erasure. She was officially classified as radioactive merchandise. The powerful directors and glamorous actors who once eagerly attended her Beverly Hills dinner parties suddenly suffered from a corporate-mandated amnesia. Completely excommunicated from the industry she had helped conquer, stripped of her professional identity, and robbed of her financial security, Mayo was forced into a humiliating exile. Retreating to her home state of Oregon was not a dignified retirement. It was a tragic surrender. She dragged her failing body back to the rainy Pacific Northwest, retreating into the darkest, most isolated shadows she could find. The magnificent woman who once stood at the epicenter of American culture was now alone in an obscure room, desperately trying to drown the deafening silence with an endless tide of cheap liquor. The most agonizing torture of her exile was the inescapable global omnipresence of the man who had destroyed her. She could not walk past a local movie theater or open a daily newspaper without being confronted by the towering myth of Humphrey Bogart. She was forced to sit in the dark, forgotten by the world, watching the man she built rewrite Hollywood history with a flawless teenage bride by his side. By 1951, the brilliant Broadway queen, once known as the Portland Rose, had been reduced to a ghost. She was only 47 years old, an age that should represent the intellectual prime of a woman's life. But her physical vessel was shattered by chronic addiction and the crushing weight of being utterly discarded. She did not experience a dignified Hollywood departure. She departed this reality in absolute solitude, trapped inside a cheap, run-down motel room in Oregon. There were no flashing cameras. There were no adoring fans. She left behind a cold, abandoned physical form that remained undiscovered in that desolate room for several days before a single soul realized she had slipped away. When the news of her tragic passing reached the glittering gates of California, the Hollywood studio system offered nothing but a terrifying silence. There were no grand memorial services funded by Warner Brothers. No glamorous co-stars came to pay their respects to the woman who was once their undisputed equal. And Humphrey Bogart? The man whose immortal cinematic myth was constructed directly upon the bleeding foundation of her sacrifices did not attend the funeral. He ignored the burial of the woman who had protected him when he was a nobody. But the most haunting forensic evidence of this case was not her physical decline. It was the tragic inventory of what she left behind. When the authorities cleared her lonely, forgotten room, they discovered a single, small box. Inside, there were no remnants of her brilliant Broadway career or her vast lost fortune. There was only a collection of heavily worn photographs of Humphrey Bogart and a final, desperately scribbled letter that was never mailed. The pages were stained with a mixture of anger and paralyzing humiliation. But beneath the furious ink, the letter revealed the inescapable tragedy, a blind, desperate, and unbroken love. Even as she took her final breaths, she was fiercely holding on to the ghost of the exact same man who had pushed her into the abyss. The autopsy officially concludes here. The architect of her destruction never had to stand trial. Humphrey Bogart continued to effortlessly stride across velvet red carpets, permanently cementing his status as the ultimate masculine icon. The capitalist machine of Hollywood did not merely erase a towering career, It methodically stripped away the sanity of a heart that simply loved too fiercely. Fame handed them a dazzling insured crown, but the system forced her to pay the invoice with her very soul. Hollywood has never been a sanctuary for those who dare to carry a genuinely devoted heart. It is a predatory ecosystem that demands your submission and punishes your loyalty with total erasure. Thank you for having the courage to open this dark archive with me. Do you believe true justice ever exists in the entertainment machine, or the victims permanently buried beneath the box office receipts? Do not forget to leave your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and wait for our next investigation on the Fame Autopsy. Because beneath the blinding flashbulbs, no truth is ever clean.